Parker rifled through my purse, shook my vitamin bottles like maracas, and announced to the whole stable they were dementia pills. When I tried defending myself, he smirked that women like me ruin the atmosphere and should go rot in a nursing home. I stayed silent, but 1 year later he was dragged from a courtroom in shackles, screaming at the jury. Okay, you are not going to believe what happened. Someone actually called me a pathetic old woman to my face, totally unaware that I held the keys to their entire future in my hands. This story is wild, so buckle up. I'd been dating William for about 6 months when he asked me to do something pretty unusual. See, he wanted to leave everything to his grandson Parker, who worked as a writing instructor at William's country club. But William had this nagging feeling. He needed to know if Parker was genuinely the respectful young man he pretended to be at family dinners. So he asked me to evaluate him. I showed up at the club looking completely unassuming. I wore my oldest clothes, drove my beloved beat-up car that William's always begging me to ditch, and played the part of a widow on a fixed income who'd always dreamed of learning to ride. What Parker had no clue about was that his grandfather was waiting for my call to decide whether to write him out of the will completely. The moment I approached the stables, Parker's eyes raked over me. They stopped on my discount store sneakers and my drugstore reading glasses. "Ma'am, I think you're confused," he announced, loud enough for other club members to hear. "The community center offers senior activities on Thursdays. This is an exclusive equestrian program." When I insisted I wanted to learn to ride, he actually laughed at me. He had the nerve to ask if I'd gotten lost on my way to bingo. My stomach nodded. I already knew what I'd have to tell William. But I stayed in character, explaining I'd saved up for lessons as a retirement gift to myself. Parker's face twisted with pure annoyance. He tried to tell me their insurance didn't cover people over 65. An obvious lie, because I'd seen older members riding just moments before. When I pointed out I was only 62, he changed tactics. Suddenly, I needed a doctor's note, a physical fitness test, and proof of supplemental insurance. "We can't have people breaking hips and suing us," he sneered. "Maybe try something safer, like walking around the mall." But I persisted. So he led me to the oldest, most aggressive horse in the stable, claiming this was the beginner horse. It was clearly unsuitable. "Let's see if you can even get close without having a heart attack," he challenged, opening the stall door. The horse lunged at me, making me stumble backward. Parker just stood there and laughed. "See? You're already too scared. Horses can sense weakness and desperation." When I still didn't leave, Parker decided to test my flexibility. He made me try to lift my leg to stirrup height, and while he and other staff watched, he kept raising his hand higher, mocking how I couldn't reach it. "Your arthritis is showing, Grandma," he said, the words dripping with disdain. "Maybe stick to activities that don't require working joints." He even called over younger riders to watch me struggle, telling them this was why they had age limits. The whole spectacle attracted his coworker, Steve, who suggested they could give me lessons for a special senior rate of $500 per session, cash only. Parker jumped on it, claiming it was a discount from their usual $1,000, adding, "If you can't afford it, you don't belong at our club anyway. We don't do payment plans for Social Security checks." He already had his hand out. When I hesitated about the cash, Parker accused me of wasting his time. Then, he did something truly audacious. He started going through my purse, which I'd set down, claiming he was checking if I could even afford to be there. He pulled out my flip phone and mocked it. He read my grocery coupons aloud. And then the absolute gall, he shook my medication bottles like maracas. "Dementia pills," he announced, though they were just vitamins. He found my car keys and asked what I drove. I told him the retired make and model of my beloved beater, and he cracked up. He actually walked me to the parking lot just to see it. Then he started taking pictures of my car to post in the staff group chat. He opened my car door without permission and rummaged through it, pocketing the $20 from the console. "That's my tip for having to deal with you," he declared. $20? That's pathetic, even for a poor old woman. Back at the stables, Parker flat out told me he'd changed his mind about lessons entirely. "You're making members uncomfortable with your poverty vibes," he said. "Women like you ruin the atmosphere. You probably collect cats and smell like mothballs." He actually suggested I spend my remaining years somewhere appropriate, like a nursing home, where they're paid to pretend to care about you. Then he grabbed my arm hard and started physically escorting me off the property, telling security I was a confused old woman who'd been harassing members. He even whispered to the guard, "She's probably off her meds. Might want to call Adult Protective Services." As he pushed me toward the exit, he leaned in and hissed, "My grandfather owns half this town, and if you try to complain about me, I'll make sure you're banned from every business he's connected to." That's when my phone rang. It was William's special ringtone. I answered it on speaker, while Parker's hand was still clamped on my arm. "How did it go, darling?" William's voice boomed through the speaker. "Did Parker treat you well?" Parker froze. He recognized his grandfather's voice. His face cycled through confusion, then recognition, then absolute, dawning horror as he stared at me. "Actually, William," I said, looking directly into Parker's now terrified eyes, "your grandson just threatened to use your name to ban me from every business in town, right after he stole $20 from my car and told me I belong in a nursing home." The entire stable went silent. The only sound was the horses shifting in their stalls. Parker's hand dropped from my arm like it was on fire. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. Riders who'd been getting ready for afternoon lessons stopped what they were doing, staring at us. Parker finally managed to croak out a single word, more a question than anything else, while I kept the phone steady between us. William's voice came through the speaker again, asking if I was hurt. I looked down at my arm. Red marks were already turning purple from Parker's grip. Parker started talking fast, words tumbling over each other about misunderstandings and jokes. Steve, his coworker, backed away from us, pale, inching toward the office door as he realized what was happening. William told me to stay on the line and get James Whitmore to the stables immediately. Parker lunged forward trying to grab my phone, but I stepped back quickly. 3 members who'd been watching from the viewing area already had their phones out, recording everything. Parker's eyes darted between them and me like a trapped animal. I called the main office on another member's phone, asking for James to come to the stables urgently, William still waiting on speaker. James arrived in under 5 minutes, his usually perfect composure cracking when he saw Parker's panicked face and heard William's voice demanding to know how his employees treated potential members. Parker tried to tell James I'd been trespassing, but those 3 recording members immediately spoke up, confirming they watched Parker mock me and physically grab me. William's voice was ice cold as he told James he'd be there in 20 minutes, and Parker wasn't to move from that spot. He asked me to recount everything. I described the mockery, the dangerous horse Parker tried to put me on, the $20 he took from my car, and his threat about using William's name to ban me from town. James's face got paler with each detail, looking between me and Parker as if he couldn't believe what he was hearing. We waited in tense silence, broken only by Parker's frantic pacing and the constant buzzing of his phone as he desperately tried calling his mother, Rebecca, over and over. Steve had completely vanished. James pulled out his tablet to review security footage, his expression getting darker as he scrolled. 15 minutes felt like hours, with Parker leaving increasingly desperate voicemails for his mother, while other members gathered to watch the drama unfold. Then William's Mercedes pulled up outside. He moved faster than I'd ever seen him, his cane hitting the ground hard with each step. He came straight to me, not even glancing at Parker, his hands gentle as he examined the bruises on my arm and asked if I needed a doctor. Parker started to speak, but William held up a hand to silence him and turned to James, demanding all security footage from today immediately. We followed James to his office. He pulled up the footage on his computer. There it was, Parker going through my car, putting the $20 in his pocket. The cameras had caught everything, including Parker taking photos of my car to mock it, and him grabbing my arm to force me toward the exit. William pulled out his phone and called Victoria on speaker. His voice was steady as he told her to freeze Parker's trust fund access immediately and remove him from all estate documents. Parker dropped to his knees right there in the office, begging and crying, but William wouldn't even look at him as Victoria confirmed she'd handle everything within the hour. 20 minutes later, the office door burst open. It was Rebecca, Parker's mother, in a white designer suit and pearls. She took one look at Parker still on his knees and immediately started yelling at William about how dare he treat their grandson this way. William didn't say a word. He just pulled out James's tablet and started the security footage from the beginning. Rebecca watched her son mock me about my age, tell me to go to bingo. Her face got tight when she saw him lie about insurance. She gripped the edge of the desk when Parker brought me to the aggressive horse and laughed as it charged at me. Her knuckles went white watching him make me try to reach the stirrup while other staff laughed. When the footage showed Parker going through my purse and shaking my medication bottles like toys, she put her hand over her mouth. The part where he took the $20 from my car made her close her eyes. But then she saw him grab my arm hard enough to leave bruises and physically drag me toward the exit. She stood up so fast her chair fell over. The slap she gave Parker echoed through the office, leaving a red handprint on his cheek. Everyone just stared as she turned to me, tears streaming down her makeup. She said, "This wasn't the first time." Then she started listing everything she'd hidden from William. Parker got expelled from his first college for stealing laptops from dorms. The second college kicked him out for bullying a disabled student until the kid dropped out. She'd paid off 3 different families over the years to keep them from pressing charges. She'd been covering for him since middle school, when he started taking money from other kids' backpacks. It was shocking. The next morning, I was holding a bag of frozen peas on my bruised arm when William called. His voice sounded tired as he told me Parker had slept in his car because Rebecca locked him out of the house. He asked if I could write down everything that happened and take pictures of the bruises for Victoria to use. He'd already gotten statements from the other staff members who watched Parker humiliate me. Later that day, Steve showed up at the club, trying to claim Parker had forced him to go along with everything. But James had already pulled footage from the past 3 months showing Steve and Parker working together. They'd been doing this to other older members for months. One video showed them laughing about charging an 80-year-old woman $600 for a 15-minute lesson. Another showed Steve pocketing cash while Parker distracted an elderly man. James fired them both on the spot and started calling every member they'd overcharged to offer refunds. 2 days later, Parker showed up at William's house, banging on the door and screaming about his inheritance. William let him in, but had his phone recording in his pocket. Parker called me a gold digger who'd tricked his grandfather. He said I'd set him up and none of this was fair. That's when William played a recording Victoria had found on Parker's social media from 3 months earlier. In it, Parker was at a bar with friends, joking about how he couldn't wait for the old man to die. He talked about buying a Ferrari with the inheritance money. He laughed about how he'd never have to work again once William was gone. Parker's face went white when he heard his own voice saying his grandfather was too stupid to see who he really was. 3 days after that, Victoria filed a civil suit against Parker for assault and theft. The country club's board voted to ban both Parker and Steve permanently. James sent out an email to all members explaining what had happened. Within hours, other elderly members started calling with their own stories. One woman said Parker had charged her $800, then spent the whole lesson on his phone. A man in his 70s said Steve had taken his credit card to process payment, then used it at a gas station. Another member said Parker had made fun of her hearing aids during a lesson. Marcus, William's other son, flew in from Boston the next day and went straight to William's house. I could hear him yelling from the driveway about how this whole thing was insane. He wanted to know why William had to test Parker like this instead of just talking to him. But then William told him about all the times Rebecca had covered up Parker's behavior. Marcus hadn't known about the college expulsions or the families Rebecca had paid off. He admitted he'd stopped visiting because he couldn't stand watching Rebecca enable Parker anymore. He'd tried to talk to her about it years ago, but she'd accused him of being jealous of her son. The next week, William brought me to his house to show me Parker's room. Every surface was covered with expensive electronics still in boxes. The closet was full of designer clothes with tags still on them. William opened drawer after drawer, showing me receipts for outrageously expensive dinners and clubs. He calculated that Parker had blown through $200,000 in just 2 years. There were charges for bottle service at clubs that cost more than most people's rent. Parker had bought 3 different gaming systems he'd never even opened. The worst part was finding receipts for things Parker had bought, then returned for cash. That same night, Parker posted on social media, claiming elder abuse. He called me a scam artist who'd manipulated his sick grandfather. He posted the pictures he'd taken of my car, calling it pathetic, and saying I was after William's money. But within an hour, the comments started pouring in from people with their own Parker stories. A girl from his high school said he'd stolen money from her locker. A guy from college said Parker had sold him a laptop that turned out to be stolen. Former coworkers from 3 different jobs shared stories about Parker getting them in trouble for things he'd done. The post had over 200 comments by morning, and Parker deleted it, but people had already taken screenshots. Rebecca called William crying the next day because she discovered her jewelry box was empty. She found pawn shop receipts hidden in Parker's room for her mother's ring and her pearl necklace. Her credit card statement showed charges at casinos she'd never been to. She checked her bank account and found $5,000 missing. When she looked deeper, she found Parker had been taking money from her for years. The pawn shop receipts went back 18 months. He'd even sold a watch that had belonged to her father. She found betting apps on his tablet with thousands of dollars in debt. Parker had been stealing from everyone around him to fund his gambling, and nobody had noticed because Rebecca always covered for him. A week later, the district attorney's office called me about pressing charges for assault and theft. The woman on the phone said they had the security footage from the country club and 6 witnesses who saw Parker grab me and steal from my car. She explained the case was strong, but they needed to know if William wanted his grandson prosecuted. I could hear William in the next room, pacing back and forth while I talked to her. When I hung up and went to find him, he was standing by the window looking out at his garden, his shoulders slumped. We walked outside together and sat on the stone bench near the roses he planted when his wife was still alive. He started telling me about Parker as a little boy, how he used to help plant these same roses and would bring his grandfather drawings he'd made at school. William blamed himself for not seeing what Parker had become, for letting Rebecca make excuses every time something went wrong after her divorce. His hands shook as he described the bright, loving child who turned into someone who could hurt people without caring. Before he could decide about the charges, James called from the country club to tell us Steve had agreed to testify against Parker to avoid his own charges. Steve had admitted to the investigators that Parker was selling member information to marketing companies and keeping the money. James said Steve had records showing Parker made at least $50,000 just from selling phone numbers and addresses. While we were still processing that news, William's phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. The woman introduced herself as Claire, Parker's ex-girlfriend from 2 years ago. She said she'd heard about what happened at the club and wanted William to know she had recordings of Parker from when they dated. In the recordings, Parker bragged about his plans to put William in a nursing home as soon as he got his inheritance. Claire told us she'd left Parker after catching him stealing her grandmother's pain medication to sell to other people at the club. She'd kept the recordings because she was scared of him and wanted proof in case he ever came after her. Victoria arrived at William's office the next morning with 3 boxes of financial documents. She spread papers across his desk, showing every transaction she'd traced over the past 5 years. Parker had stolen over $500,000 through fake charity donations in William's name, false expense reports from the club, and credit cards he'd opened using William's information. Victoria pointed to each fraudulent transaction with her pen, her voice getting tighter with each number she read. William sat there staring at the evidence until finally he picked up the phone and told the district attorney to file charges. 2 days later, Parker hired a lawyer named David Morse, using money he'd borrowed from loan sharks, according to what Victoria found out. Morse filed a competency claim against William, saying I was manipulating a senile old man for his money. The legal papers accused me of elder abuse and claimed William wasn't mentally capable of making decisions about his estate. Strange cars started showing up outside my apartment building that week. My neighbor mentioned seeing the same black sedan parked across the street 3 nights in a row. Then the phone calls started, always from different numbers, with someone breathing heavily before hanging up. My building security guard pulled me aside one morning and said he'd seen Parker in the lobby the previous night, even though Parker didn't live in the building. The guard had asked Parker to leave, but Parker claimed he was visiting a friend and refused to say who. William wanted me to move into his guest house immediately for safety, but I knew that would just give Parker's lawyer more ammunition for the gold digger claims. We argued about it for an hour before compromising on having a security system installed in my apartment. The company came the next day and put in cameras, motion sensors, and a panic button that connected directly to the police. For days after that, Rebecca called and asked if she could meet with me privately. She showed up at the coffee shop looking like she hadn't slept in days, her usually perfect hair unwashed, and her designer clothes wrinkled. She broke down completely as soon as she sat down, sobbing so hard people at other tables turned to stare. She admitted she'd created this monster by always bailing Parker out, by never letting him face consequences for anything he did. She told me she'd started seeing a therapist to understand how she'd enabled such cruelty in her own son. The therapist had helped her see that every time she'd covered for Parker, she taught him he could hurt people without punishment. That afternoon, I went to the country club to pick up some papers James had for William. When I came back out to the parking lot, all 4 of my tires had been slashed. The rubber was shredded and there were deep gouges in the sidewalls. Security footage mysteriously showed nothing because of a camera malfunction that had happened right before I'd arrived. The guard mentioned he'd seen someone who looked like Parker's friend, Trevor, near my car earlier, but couldn't be sure since the guy was wearing a baseball cap pulled low. The tow truck took 2 hours to arrive, and while I waited, my phone started buzzing with confused messages from friends asking why I was posting such awful things on Facebook. I grabbed my phone and checked my account, but couldn't log in because someone had changed my password. My neighbor sent me screenshots of posts from a profile with my name and photo, calling immigrants parasites, and saying old people should be denied medical care to save money. The post had been shared dozens of times already, and angry comments were pouring in from people I'd known for years. I tried reporting the fake account, but Facebook said they needed more proof it wasn't really me. More fake profiles popped up on Twitter and Instagram with my museum headshot posting racist rants about how certain people didn't belong in museums. My former coworkers started texting asking if I'd had some kind of breakdown. The posts included details only someone who knew me would know, like the name of my first cat and the street I grew up on. By the time I got home that night, 14 different people had called or messaged about the posts, and 3 had already blocked my real accounts thinking I'd gone crazy. The next morning, I drove straight to the police station to file a report about everything. The detective looked tired as he wrote down the slashed tires, fake profiles, and property damage. He said without direct proof linking Parker to any of it, their hands were tied. He suggested I start keeping detailed records of every incident with dates and times and any witnesses. He gave me a case number and said to call if anything escalated, but basically admitted they couldn't do much unless Parker made a mistake. That evening, Marcus called and invited William and me to dinner at their house. Victoria had made pasta, and we sat around their dining table while Marcus poured wine and apologized for not believing me at first about Parker. He said he'd been blind to his son's behavior for too long because it was easier than admitting the truth. Then he told us about finding out Parker had stolen $8,000 from his daughter's college fund 3 years ago. Parker had convinced Rebecca it was just a banking error, and Marcus had only learned the truth when he'd checked the statements himself. Victoria pulled out a folder with copies of forged checks and altered bank statements Parker had created to cover his tracks. She said as a lawyer she'd wanted to press charges, but Rebecca had begged them not to because Parker was family. Marcus's hands shook as he showed us text messages where Parker had threatened to hurt himself if they told anyone about the money. A week later, William's lawyer called to say the competency hearing had been scheduled for next month. William would need to undergo a psychological evaluation by a court-appointed doctor, and Parker's lawyer would definitely try to paint me as someone who'd manipulated a vulnerable old man. The lawyer said we needed to gather every piece of evidence showing our relationship was real, and that William was of sound mind when he'd changed his will. He warned us Parker had hired an aggressive attorney known for destroying reputations in court. That afternoon my phone rang and it was Sandra from the museum where I'd worked for 30 years. She said someone claiming to be a journalist had been calling around asking questions about my retirement. This person was implying I'd been forced out for stealing artifacts or inappropriate behavior with donors. Sandra had told them it was nonsense, but they'd already contacted 3 other former colleagues with the same questions. The fake journalist had details about specific exhibits I'd worked on and was twisting innocent situations to sound suspicious. 2 days later, William's doctor called with urgent news. Someone had tried to access William's medical records illegally by calling the office and claiming to be from his insurance company. The receptionist had gotten suspicious when they'd asked specifically about mental health diagnoses and medication for dementia. The attempt was traced to a computer at the public library, and security footage showed Parker there at that exact time, though he'd used a fake name to log in. The doctor said he'd already reported it to the authorities and would testify if needed about the HIPAA violation. I was sitting in my usual coffee shop the next morning when a woman approached my table and introduced herself as Janet Ross. She said Parker had hired her as a private investigator to dig up dirt on me, but she was uncomfortable with what he was asking her to do. She showed me text messages where Parker had offered her $5,000 extra to plant drugs in my apartment and take photos. He'd specifically said to put them somewhere that would look like I was dealing, not just using. Janet said she'd been a PI for 15 years and had never been asked to frame someone before. She'd already made recordings of Parker explaining exactly what he wanted her to do and had reported it to the police that morning. 3 days later, William and I sat at his kitchen table surrounded by 6 months' worth of photos and messages from our relationship. We organized everything chronologically, starting from our first date at the Italian restaurant where he'd spilled wine on his shirt. His hands trembled as he looked through pictures from our trip to the botanical garden and the concert we'd attended last month. He kept apologizing for Parker putting me through this and said he was terrified of losing me. I held his hand and promised we'd get through it together. But I could see the stress was taking a toll on his health. He'd lost weight and wasn't sleeping well, and his doctor had increased his blood pressure medication. Janet came by that evening with a USB drive containing all her recordings of Parker. In one recording, you could hear him clearly saying he wanted her to plant cocaine in my apartment and call in an anonymous tip. He'd even researched which judges were toughest on drug crimes and wanted the raid to happen when one of them was on duty. Janet had already given copies to the detective handling our case and said she'd testify in court about Parker's attempts to frame me. She also mentioned Parker had asked her to seduce William and take compromising photos, but she'd refused. The next week, I was loading groceries into my car when Parker appeared behind me in the parking lot. He grabbed my cart and shoved it hard into another car, then started screaming that I'd ruined his life and turned his whole family against him. He said I was nothing but a gold-digging whore who'd brainwashed his grandfather, and he'd make sure I paid for it. His face was red and spit flew from his mouth as he backed me against my car. Several shoppers stopped to watch, and 2 men rushed over when Parker raised his fist like he was going to hit me. Someone called 911 and Parker tried to run, but security guards from the store blocked him. The police arrived within minutes, and this time, they had multiple witnesses to Parker threatening and attempting to assault me. They arrested him right there in the parking lot, while he screamed that his grandfather would have them all fired. At the county jail 2 nights later, Rebecca finally posted Parker's bail, but the judge had set strict conditions, including no contact with me or William and GPS monitoring on his ankle. Parker's lawyer argued these conditions would hurt his competency case, but the judge wasn't having it after seeing the parking lot video. Meanwhile, Victoria was digging into Parker's background for William's defense and found something shocking when she called the college Parker claimed to have graduated from. They had no record of him graduating because he'd been expelled in his junior year for cheating. But he'd been telling everyone, including James at the country club, that he had his degree. Victoria immediately sent the documentation to James, who discovered Parker's entire resume was fake, and he'd never actually verified any of it when he hired him 3 years ago. 5 days after the parking lot incident, I went back to my volunteer shift at the library, where the whole staff had heard about what happened. They surrounded me with hugs and support, bringing me cookies and tea while sharing their own stories about dealing with difficult people. The head librarian told me she banned Parker from the library years ago for harassing teenage volunteers and stealing DVDs. That same week, William had his psychological evaluation with a court-appointed psychiatrist who spent 3 hours testing his memory and cognitive abilities. The doctor told us afterward that William scored better than most people half his age, and included in his report that Parker's harassment looked like a clear attempt at financial exploitation of an elderly person. David, Parker's lawyer, must have realized how bad things were getting because he suddenly withdrew from representing Parker, filing paperwork saying Parker hadn't paid him and there were ethical concerns about continuing. Parker showed up at the competency hearing representing himself and started making wild accusations about me drugging William and forging documents. The judge kept interrupting him to ask for evidence, which Parker didn't have, just getting louder and more desperate with each objection. Rebecca had reached her breaking point when she discovered Parker had been using her address to take out loans from sketchy lenders who were now showing up at her door demanding payment. She went straight to court and filed for a restraining order against her own son, then hired a security company to change all her locks and install cameras. She told me later she'd found out he'd stolen her credit cards and maxed them out on gambling sites. A week after that, William met with his estate lawyer to revise his will, leaving Parker exactly $1 with a note saying he wasn't forgotten, just not forgiven. Instead of the millions Parker expected, William set up scholarships for kids from poor families who wanted to learn horseback riding at the country club. The country club members organized a surprise lunch for me where dozens of people shared their own Parker horror stories that they'd been too scared to tell before. One woman said he'd charged her 90-year-old mother $2,000 for a lesson, then claimed she never paid. Another member revealed Parker had been stealing equipment from the club and selling it online. Then we got unexpected news when Parker's friend, Trevor, got arrested after bragging at a bar about slashing my tires for Parker. The police picked him up, and he immediately told them Parker had paid him $500 to mess with my car, and promised him more for scaring me. Trevor even had the text messages where Parker gave him my license plate and told him to make my life hell. The competency hearing finally concluded 3 months after it started, with the judge not only dismissing Parker's claim, but recommending the prosecutor add charges for filing fraudulent legal documents. Parker completely lost it in the courtroom, screaming that we'd all regret this, and that his grandfather would be sorry. Security had to physically drag him out while he kicked chairs and threw papers everywhere. 3 days later, James called me in a panic, saying 2 huge guys in leather jackets were at the country club demanding to see Parker and wouldn't leave. I drove over immediately and found them in the lobby telling James that Parker owed them $50,000 and had signed papers saying his grandfather, William, would cover the debt if he couldn't pay. James had already called the police, but these guys weren't backing down, showing him contracts with Parker's signature and William's name all over them. The police arrived and escorted them out, but not before they promised they'd be back to collect what they were owed one way or another. Marcus heard about this and decided to make one last attempt with his son, meeting him at the jail where Parker was being held on the previous charges. I wasn't there, but Marcus told me later how he'd offered to pay for the best rehab facility in the country plus therapy, if Parker would just admit what he'd done and get help. Parker's response was to spit in his father's face and tell him he was dead to him, that he'd rather rot in jail than take anything from a traitor. Marcus left that meeting with tears in his eyes, knowing he'd lost his son forever. Victoria came to my apartment the next day with boxes of evidence files, and we spent hours organizing everything into a timeline. Looking at the pattern laid out on my dining room table made my skin crawl, because you could see exactly how Parker had been getting more desperate and dangerous with each passing week. The receipts, the threats, the escalating violence. It all painted a picture of someone who'd completely lost control and would do anything to get what he thought he deserved. That night around 2 a.m. my phone rang. It was William's security company saying someone had broken into his house. I threw on clothes and raced over to find police cars everywhere and William standing in his driveway looking pale and shaken. The officers had caught Parker in William's home office, trying to stuff financial documents and valuable items into a bag. He'd violated the restraining order and committed burglary, which meant he was going back to jail with even more charges. The stress of seeing his grandson arrested in his own home was too much for William. He clutched his chest, his breathing getting shallow and rapid. The paramedics rushed him to the hospital where doctors said he'd had a mild cardiac episode brought on by stress. I sat beside his hospital bed, holding his hand while machines beeped around us, and he squeezed my fingers weakly. "I'm grateful you showed me the truth," he whispered. "No matter how much it hurts to know what Parker really is." He recovered over the next few days, but the whole incident had changed something in him, made him more determined to use his wealth for good. 2 days after the break-in, the district attorney's office called to inform us they were upgrading Parker's charges to felony burglary and elder abuse. With his previous charges and the new ones, he was looking at serious prison time, and the judge set bail at $100,000 that nobody was willing to post. William used his recovery time productively, working with his lawyers to establish a foundation for elderly victims of family financial abuse, naming it after his late wife, Margaret. He said if anything good could come from this nightmare, it would be helping other families avoid what we'd gone through. Meanwhile, Steve had been working with prosecutors and decided to plead guilty to theft charges in exchange for probation and community service. During his testimony, he revealed something that made everyone in the courtroom gasp. Parker had been researching slow-acting poisons online and had asked Steve about medications that could cause heart problems in elderly people without being detected. Steve said Parker had been planning to gradually make William sick enough to speed up the inheritance, but not sick enough to raise suspicions. Rebecca had been trying to stay out of everything, but the loan sharks Parker owed money to had tracked her down and started threatening her if she didn't tell them where to find her son. The threats got so bad that prosecutors arranged for her to enter witness protection temporarily, while she helped them build their case. She provided years of financial records showing how Parker had been stealing from family members since he was a teenager, forging checks and taking credit cards without permission. Even from jail, Parker couldn't stop making things worse for himself. He approached another inmate offering to pay him to intimidate me once he got out. What Parker didn't know was that the inmate was actually an undercover officer investigating corruption in the jail system. They recorded the whole conversation and added charges for soliciting assault to Parker's growing list of crimes. 2 weeks later, Victoria called me with news that made my stomach drop. She'd been digging through Parker's records at the country club and found evidence of him stealing from at least 12 other elderly members over the past 2 years. Each person had been charged extra fees that went straight into Parker's pocket, adding up to over $30,000 total. Victoria had contacted every single victim, and they all wanted to testify against him. William and I started going to counseling together because the whole situation was messing with our heads pretty bad. The therapist helped us see how Parker had been playing mind games with both of us for years, making William doubt his own judgment and making me question if I was good enough for William's world. We sat there holding hands while the therapist explained how people like Parker use family bonds as weapons. Word spread fast through the horse community about what Parker had done. The National Writing Association pulled his teaching certificates after getting complaints from 3 different states where he'd worked before. Nobody would hire him now, even if he wasn't sitting in jail. Janet, the private investigator, went to the grand jury with boxes of evidence about Parker trying to frame me for elder abuse. She had recordings of his phone calls, copies of the fake reports he'd filed, and testimony from 3 other staff members who'd heard him bragging about his plan. The grand jury came back with 7 new charges against him. Then things got really scary when Parker's cellmate came forward, saying Parker had tried to pay him to hurt William once he got out. The cellmate had been wearing a wire for the FBI on a different case and caught the whole conversation. Now the feds were involved because Parker had mentioned having contacts in other states who could help. A week later, we sat in the prosecutor's office while she explained the plea deal they were offering Parker. 8 years in prison if he admitted to everything and gave up any claim to William's money forever. Parker's lawyer came back an hour later saying Parker refused and wanted to go to trial instead. Marcus's daughter, Sophie, called me that night offering to testify about Parker stealing from her when she was in college. She was a doctor now and said she'd kept records of everything Parker had taken from her trust fund. She wanted people to know what he'd been doing to the family for years. I finally decided to clean out my old car, the one Parker had mocked that first day at the stables. William knew I'd been thinking about trading it in, but when I got home that afternoon he'd had the whole thing restored with new paint, new seats and a rebuilt engine. He said he knew how much it meant to me and wanted me to keep it. 3 days before the trial was supposed to start, Parker fired his public defender, claiming the lawyer wasn't fighting hard enough for him. The judge told him tough luck. He couldn't delay the trial and assigned him a new lawyer who only had 1 day to get ready. When jury selection started, it became clear that Parker had screwed himself with all his social media posts from jail. Every potential juror had seen his rants about how rich people deserved to be scammed and how old people were just walking ATMs. His new lawyer couldn't find a single person who hadn't already made up their mind about him. The trial started the next morning with the prosecutor wheeling in a TV on a cart and playing security footage from the country club that made my stomach twist all over again. The video showed Parker grabbing my arm and dragging me toward the exit while I stumbled trying to keep up, then him reaching into my car and taking the $20 bill from my console while laughing. The jury members leaned forward in their seats, watching him shake my vitamin bottles and announce they were dementia pills to everyone within earshot. Several jurors shook their heads when the video showed him taking pictures of my car to mock it. The prosecutor paused the video right at the moment Parker's hand was in my purse without permission, letting that image sit on the screen while she called James to the stand. James walked up looking like he hadn't slept in days. His suit wrinkled and his face pale as he sat down and started talking about finding boxes of member complaints about Parker that had been hidden in a storage closet. He pulled out folder after folder, showing how Parker had been stealing from members for years, overcharging for lessons and pocketing the difference, with James admitting he'd failed to properly supervise his staff. His voice cracked when he announced he was resigning from the country club, effective immediately, because of his failure to protect members. The judge called me to testify next, and I walked to the stand with my hands steady, even though my heart was pounding. I explained how William had asked me to test Parker's character by pretending to be a widow on a fixed income, describing each thing Parker did from the moment I arrived at the stables. Parker jumped up from his seat, yelling, "She's lying!" His lawyer grabbed his arm, trying to pull him back down while the judge banged her gavel, warning him about another outburst. I kept talking calmly about how Parker had threatened to use William's name to ban me from businesses in town, how he'd called me pathetic, and said I belonged in a nursing home. The judge called for a recess, and as people filed out into the hallway, Rebecca walked over to me, tears running down her face. She grabbed both my hands and thanked me for having the strength to stand up to Parker when she couldn't, saying she'd been too scared of him for years to say anything about his behavior. Back in the courtroom, William took the stand, and his voice broke completely when he described discovering that Parker had been lying to him since childhood, stealing from family members and blaming others. Several jurors wiped their eyes as William talked about how Parker had stolen his dead grandmother's jewelry and let the housekeeper get fired for it. The second day of trial brought Steve to the stand where he pulled out his phone and showed text messages Parker had sent him joking about waiting for William to die, calling him the old man, and saying he couldn't wait to put him in the ground for the inheritance money. Steve's hand shook as he read the messages out loud, including one where Parker said, "Old people were just walking ATMs waiting to be emptied." Sophie testified next about how Parker had stolen her entire college fund when she was $30,000 her parents had saved, and then convinced the whole family she was lying about it for attention. She talked about 3 years of therapy, trying to get over the betrayal of having her family believe Parker over her. Her voice steady, but her hands gripping the witness stand so tight her knuckles went white. The forensic accountant came up with a laptop and projector showing charts of Parker's theft going back 5 years, with the amounts getting bigger each year, starting with a few hundred here and there and building up to $500,000 total. The jury stared at the screen showing Parker's bank deposits matching exactly with money reported missing from William's accounts and the country club's books. Parker kept passing notes to his defense attorney who looked more frustrated with each one, trying to cross-examine witnesses while Parker tugged on his sleeve and whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear him calling them all liars. During the accountant's testimony, Parker actually threw a pen at his lawyer when the man didn't object fast enough, earning another warning from the judge about his behavior. The private investigator, Janet, took the stand last that day, setting up a small speaker to play recordings she'd made of Parker, explicitly planning to frame me for theft by planting William's watch in my purse. The jury looked disgusted as they heard Parker's voice saying he'd make sure I went to jail for elder abuse, that old women like me were easy targets because no one would believe them over a young man with connections. The next day brought the FBI agent to the stand, a serious man in a dark suit who carried a laptop and a stack of papers. He opened his computer and started playing phone recordings from the jail. Parker's voice filled the courtroom as he offered someone $25,000 to hurt William and me. The jury members leaned forward as Parker's voice got more desperate in each call, promising $30,000, then $40,000, begging his cellmate to find someone on the outside. William grabbed my hand as we heard Parker describe exactly how he wanted us hurt, the agent pausing the recording to explain how they traced the calls and verified the threats. Parker's lawyer kept objecting, but the judge allowed everything, and Parker started shaking his head and muttering at the defense table. On the second day of testimony, Parker suddenly stood up and demanded to testify. His lawyer tried to pull him back down, but Parker shoved him away. The judge warned him about self-incrimination, but Parker insisted, practically running to the witness stand before anyone could stop him. He started rambling about conspiracy theories, claiming I'd seduced William for his money, that the whole family was jealous of him. The prosecutor just let him talk, occasionally asking simple questions that made Parker angrier and louder. He accused the FBI of faking the recordings, the private investigator of being paid to lie, even claimed the security footage was doctored. When the prosecutor asked about the $20 from my car, Parker's face went red, and he admitted taking it, but said it was payment for his wasted time. The courtroom went silent as he tried to explain why that wasn't theft, stumbling over his words and finally screaming that old people like me deserved it. The judge had to bang his gavel 3 times to restore order, while Parker kept yelling about unfairness and persecution. During closing arguments, the prosecutor walked the jury through every piece of evidence, from the stable incident to the break-in to the murder plot. She showed them photos of my bruises, played the recordings again, reminded them of Parker's own admissions on the stand. Parker's lawyer tried to argue for mercy, mentioning his client's age and lack of prior convictions, but kept getting interrupted by Parker's angry whispers. The defense attorney looked exhausted as he struggled to explain away the mountain of evidence, finally just asking for leniency. That night, William and I waited at his house while the jury deliberated. Neither of us could eat or really talk. He kept apologizing for bringing Parker into my life, but I held his hand and reminded him we'd faced it together. Rebecca had sent a letter to be read after the verdict, which William's lawyer had in a sealed envelope on the table. After just 4 hours, we got the call that the jury was back and we rushed to the courthouse. Parker sat completely alone at the defense table. No family members behind him, no friends in the gallery, just him and his lawyer. The foreman stood and read guilty on every single count: assault, theft, burglary, elder abuse, conspiracy, attempted murder, solicitation. Parker jumped up and started screaming obscenities at the jury, at the judge, at William and me, having to be wrestled down by 3 bailiffs. They dragged him out in handcuffs while he kept screaming threats, his voice echoing down the hallway until a door slammed. 6 weeks later, we returned for sentencing. Parker was now in an orange jumpsuit and shackles, thinner and angrier looking. The judge gave him 15 years in federal prison with no possibility of early release for 5 years, calling him a danger to society. As the guards led him away, Parker turned and spat toward where William and I sat, the spit landing on the floor as he was yanked through the door. The courtroom stayed quiet for a moment after the doors slammed shut behind him. William squeezed my hand as we stood to leave. His lawyer was already gathering papers and talking about the appeal Parker would definitely file, but wouldn't win. Outside the courthouse, reporters pushed microphones at us, but William just shook his head, and we walked to his car in silence. 2 weeks later, William called his estate lawyer to his house, where I watched him sign new documents that left his fortune to various charities and set up trust funds for Marcus's 3 kids who'd always been good to their grandfather. The lawyer explained each page while William signed, making sure the money would go to people who'd earned it through kindness, not blood. Rebecca called me a month after that, her voice shaky as she told me she'd started seeing a therapist twice a week and joined a support group for parents whose kids had gone to prison. She'd already sold her house to pay back the 3 elderly women Parker had scammed at other country clubs, moving into a 1-bedroom apartment near the highway. The country club sent us a formal letter announcing new policies requiring background checks for all staff and offering free self-defense classes every Tuesday for members over 60. James had them install a bronze plaque in the main hall honoring William's 40 years of membership and donations, though William just laughed when he saw it. 6 months after the trial, William and I sat in folding chairs at the community center, watching 3 teenagers walk across a makeshift stage to receive diplomas from his new scholarship foundation. Each kid shook his hand and thanked him for changing their lives, one girl crying as she explained she was the first in her family to finish high school. Marcus brought his whole family to our Thanksgiving 8 months after the trial. His daughter, Sophie, announced over turkey that she was engaged to a man she'd met at her new job. She raised her glass and said the trial had taught her to only keep trustworthy people in her life, looking right at William when she said it. A guard at the prison forwarded me a letter from Parker that arrived 2 weeks before Christmas. 5 pages of cramped handwriting, blaming everyone but himself for his situation. William and I read the first paragraph together before he crumpled it up and tossed it in his fireplace, watching the pages curl and blacken while we drank hot chocolate. The FBI agent who'd worked our case called on a Tuesday morning to tell us they'd arrested all 6 people Parker had been corresponding with about hiring someone to hurt us when he got out. William actually laughed on speakerphone, joking that Parker had finally accomplished something by getting federal and local law enforcement to work together. Exactly 1 year after that day at the stables, William took me back to the same spot where Parker had grabbed my arm and got down on one knee despite his bad hip. He pulled out a ring and said Parker had accidentally done him a favor by showing him who really loved him versus who just wanted his money. The engagement party 3 weeks later filled the country club's main ballroom with the same members who'd watched Parker humiliate me now raising champagne glasses to celebrate our happiness. The new writing instructor, a patient woman in her 40s, made a speech about how she loved teaching the senior classes and how much joy it brought her to see people achieving lifelong dreams. The morning after the party, I walked back into those stables, wearing proper riding boots William had bought me. The new instructor showed me how to approach the gentlest horse they had. William sat on a bench nearby, his phone ready to record my first real lesson. As I learned to hold the reins properly and sit straight in the saddle, the horse responded perfectly when I clicked my tongue the way the instructor showed me, walking forward with steady steps while I held on with hands that didn't shake at all. The instructor praised my natural balance and said I'd be cantering within a month if I kept practicing twice a week like we'd planned. William cheered from his bench when I successfully turned the horse in a circle. In that moment, I realized that Parker's cruelty had revealed something important about both of us. The test he'd unknowingly taken had shown William the truth about his grandson, but it had also shown us the strength of what we built together in just 6 months of dating. As I dismounted and the horse nuzzled my shoulder looking for the carrot the instructor handed me, I thought about how different this moment was from that first horrible day. Parker was in a federal prison cell, probably writing another angry letter to someone who wouldn't read it. While I was finally learning to ride at the place where he tried to break me, William walked over and kissed me as I fed the horse its carrot, and we made plans to come back Thursday for my second lesson. The horse followed us to the gate, and I knew with absolute certainty that this gentle animal sensed only confidence and happiness in me now, not the fear Parker had tried so hard to create.